NASA astronauts left 12 camera bodies on the surface of the Moon during the Apollo missions between the years of 1969 and 1972, and it was all premeditated in 1962. We know NASA was in dire need to have a high-quality camera to capture photos of their space missions. John Glenn had just successfully orbited the Earth 3 times, in which he was able to grab the first-ever human-captured images of the Earth with his 40 Frankenstein drugstore Walter Schirra camera. Let me introduce you to Walter Schirra, who during the same year said, "Johnny Glenn, hold my beer," as he walked into a completely different drugstore down in Houston and purchased a 500 Hasselblad 500C camera with a planar 80mm f2.8 lens, on the advice of photographers from Life magazine and National Geographic. Now Schirra was way more of a shutterbug and photo enthusiast than John Glenn was, and Schirra was also preparing for his Mercury 8 mission. I think it's quite cool that once again we see how these NASA astronauts were so involved in their missions. As far as I can tell, no one is telling them, no one at NASA saying, go out and buy some cameras for these missions. They are just going, point out, and buying cameras for themselves because they know they're going to be part of history. They're going on space travel, and they want to document this, at least for their sake. It was Schirra who introduced NASA to the Hasselblad cameras. And here's another fun fact, Hasselblad had no idea any of this was going on, and they wouldn't find out for at least another 3 years, which we'll get to hear shortly. Anyway, Schirra brings his shiny new camera back to NASA and they immediately loved what they saw, so much so that they actually went out and purchased their own Hasselblad. And after that, NASA engineers got to work, just as they did with John Glenn's camera, as the cameras needed to be as light as possible and also survive the harsh conditions of space, with temperatures ranging from 250 degrees Fahrenheit in direct sunlight all the way to -85 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. Here are the modifications that NASA did for Schirra's Hasselblad. NASA removed its leather covering, auxiliary shutter, reflex mirror, and viewfinder to make it lighter for the mission. NASA did add a side viewfinder to make it easy to use in tight spaces while wearing a helmet. A new film magazine was constructed to allow for 70 exposures instead of the 12 that you would typically get with medium format versus 35mm format. And yes, this is a good time to point this out, the Hasselblad is a medium format camera versus John Glenn's 35mm format camera. So instead of 36 frames that you get on 35mm, with the 6x6 huge negative size of medium format, you only get 12 exposures. Here's the difference between the size in 35mm film and 6x6 medium format film. Dare I say it, that we are taking one large step for mankind here. I said it. Dad joke. Let's get on with it. Finally, NASA painted the outside of the camera matte black to cut down reflections inside the orbiter, because as we all know, if you're trying to shoot out a window you typically get reflections, unless there's something dark to obscure that. The Mercury 8 mission with Walter Schirra was just the starting point for NASA and Hasselblad. NASA would continue to use these Hasselblad cameras in future missions, unbeknownst to Hasselblad, which is once again bonkers to me. That was until 3 years later, in 1965 during the Gemini 4 mission. The Hasselblad camera was there when Ed White performed his famous spacewalk. When the stunning images were finally released to the public, the Swedish camera company finally put 2 and 2 together and said, "Hey, I think these photos were taken with our camera." This is mind-boggling to me, because no one at NASA even thought to pick up the phone and say, "Hey, help us out with this. What should we be doing? How can we make this better?" No. Once again, it was the astronauts going out, getting these cameras, and then NASA engineers just engineering the crap out of it so that they could use it in space. But it was Hasselblad that reached out immediately once they put 2 and 2 together to see if there's any way that they could help out. Even in 1965, it would seem that NASA's priorities lie in the scientific realm, and photography is just an afterthought. Because quite frankly, I would have thought that they would have reached out to Hasselblad first to make a camera that would fit their needs. I guess maybe it's a pride thing. I could see NASA engineers being like, no, we got this. We don't need anything. We'll just Frankenstein the crap out of this. Long story short, This was the beginning of a beautiful relationship between NASA and Hasselblad, one that gave us some of the most iconic images of the last century, including Earthrise, a photo taken by astronaut Bill Anders from the command module of Apollo 8 on Christmas Eve 1968. And it was this beautiful relationship between NASA and Hasselblad that would ultimately put 12 cameras to their final resting spot on the surface of the Moon. By the time the Apollo missions had rolled around, Hasselblad and NASA had been working hand-in-hand to develop the Hasselblad 500EL, a new and improved camera for space travel. The 500EL was a camera that was suited for long flight durations and the hostile lunar environment. Hasselblad built a custom high-capacity film holder, and then Kodak stepped in and produced a film that had a thinner emulsion layer. This combination resulted in being able to shoot hundreds of photos on one film back. Imagine being able to shoot 160 color photos or 200 black and white photos on one film back without having to change anything. The Zeiss Biogon 60mm f5.6 lens was the lens of choice to document the lunar surface, and thus was strapped, or rather mounted, to Neil Armstrong's chest. This lens was specifically made and engineered and designed for NASA for the specific need, but it would be later available to the public. So if you're like me and you like history, and you like photography and all this crazy stuff, you could go out and buy a Hasselblad 500 series camera and then go out and buy the Zeiss 60mm lens, and you would have a part of history. No one else would know it, but you would know that this combination of lens and camera went to the Moon. As with Glenn's camera, there were modifications made here too. The shutter button and other controls on the camera were made larger for ease of use while the astronauts were in their thick protective gloves and moon suits. And the astronauts were given suggested exposure settings for a variety of scenarios. There were electric motors inside the Hasselblad 500EL, which greatly automated the lunar photography. The astronauts still had to set shutter speed, aperture, and distance, or focus, as we know it. When the shutter was finally released, the exposure would happen and the electric motors within the camera would advance to the next frame. So to set the shutter speed, aperture, and focus or distance, there were special levers that were designed and attached to this camera, once again, to make everything easy to use with those bulky gloves. There was also this thing called a reso plate. Now if you don't know what a reso plate is, that was just a plate that was placed close to the film plane and had these cross marks on it. These cross marks are famous in any of the lunar photos that you see, but they serve two main purposes. 1. They allowed for correcting film distortions, and 2. It helped judge distance and measure things in these photos. These cross marks were calibrated to within 0.002 of a millimeter, and that's how they could accurately measure and judge distances while on the Moon, because there were no landmarks, if you will, on the Moon. Finally, a special lubricant was produced that could withstand the huge temperature swings on the lunar surface. Like the earliest Hasselblads on the Mercury flights, the data camera lacked a conventional viewfinder. Instead, astronauts went through training here on Earth to learn how to aim the camera by feel from chest level, as that's where the camera was attached to. On July 20, 1969, the Apollo 11 lunar module landed with two cameras, but only one went outside, and it was carried by Neil Armstrong. This explains why nearly every photograph that we have from that mission is of Buzz Aldrin. Neil Armstrong had the only camera for nearly the entire 2.5 hours that the two walked around the Sea of Tranquility. An official NASA document actually describes how the space agency's public affairs department had to scramble to satisfy the world's media for photos of the historic moonwalk, and they suddenly discovered an embarrassing oversight. They started looking for the best shot of Armstrong. According to a transcript, soon they were looking for any shot of Armstrong. Aldrin, who was busy setting up lunar experiments, did briefly take over the camera, and remarkably, snapped only a single photo of Armstrong. Later missions that involved longer walks on the surface of the Moon also allowed for more photography time, and each astronaut actually had their own camera strapped to their chest. However, this led to NASA actually having a hard time distinguishing the two astronauts, because everyone's wearing the same spacesuit and everyone's got a camera strapped to their chest. So much so, that a red stripe was added to the commander's suit at the arms, legs, and helmet. In total, thousands of pictures came back from the surface of the Moon during these 6 missions, and most of them had been taken with the Hasselblads. But NASA was nervous about having enough fuel to get off the Moon and back to the orbiting command module. So instead of loading up the Hasselblad cameras and lenses, they opted for, get this, moon rocks instead. This kills me as a photographer, but I think I get it. Obviously, you go to the moon, you want to bring back something to study and everything. But to bring back that 5 pounds of camera gear. I mean, come on. So they opted for the space rocks, and they tossed those beautiful, one-of-a-kind, unique Hasselblads and their lenses to their final resting spots on the moon. And that is where they remain today, untouched, at the 6 Apollo landing sites. If you like all things photography like I do, then go ahead and join the community we're growing here on YouTube by subscribing down below. And as always, if you have any feedback, comments, questions, concerns, or corrections, leave them in the comments below. I do read them all. Peace out, and until next time, I'll see you guys later. Oh, that was a long one. Lots of history. Lots of history. I think that's it though. We're good, right?